Hello. I'm going to entitle this video Don K. Preston's Amazing Admissions in Stating the Death of 1 Corinthians 15 is Physical Death. And this is going to be short and sweet, guys. This is going to be short and sweet. The background to this, I've asked Don for the past 3 days and he finally answered this morning. I asked him a simple question. What does asleep mean, or fallen asleep as some translations put it, mean in 1 Corinthians 15 verse 6 and especially verse 20? Because verse 20 is critical, because 20 through 28 is one section. And Don, here's his response. He says, Don K. Preston, Joel Sexton Wow, are you going to play these games? Joel Sexton, I've told you that you do not control my agenda. You do not control when I answer or how I answer. When I don't answer on your time frame, does not mean you have posed some daunting questions. Cool your jets and act maturely. And then he puts 1 Corinthians 15:6 equals those who have fallen asleep equals physical death. 1 Corinthians 15:20 equals physical death. 1 Corinthians 15:51 equals physical death. We shall not all sleep. Then he says, Paul said not all of that generation would die before the resurrection. But you say they did. That means that either Paul was wrong or you are. Okay. And so I posed this question to him for 3 days. Just a simple question. He can make lengthy posts when it comes to Daniel 7 and Matthew 16, but he wouldn't answer this simple question. And so he answered probably under duress. He didn't want to answer the question. Because once you admit what asleep actually means, his corporate body view just goes out the window, especially when it comes to verse 20. But very briefly, verse 6, after that, he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, most who remain until now, but some have fallen asleep. That's clearly physical, biological death. Don agrees. And yet, another point, verse 3 through 11 of 1 Corinthians 15 is a creedal statement, the earliest creedal statement we have in the New Testament, dating back to 2 years after the crucifixion of Christ, 32 AD. Paul never had a problem with creedal statements. Colossians 1, Philippians 2, never had a problem with them. But verse 20 is where it gets very, very fascinating because it ties into verse 26. The last enemy that will be destroyed is death. What is that last enemy that will be destroyed that is death? What is that death? Well, Don says verse 20 equals physical death. And I'm going to put this post of Don in the description. But now, verse 20. I'm going to read from 20 to 26. But now Christ has been raised from the dead, the firstfruits of those who are asleep. For since by a man came death, by a man also came the resurrection of the dead. For as in Adam all die, so in Christ all will be made alive, but each in his own order. Christ the firstfruits, after that those who are Christ at his coming. Then comes the end when he hands over the kingdom to the God and Father, when he has abolished all rule, all authority, and power, for he must reign until he puts all enemies under his feet. The last enemy that will be abolished is death. Now watch, verse 20. But now Christ has been raised from the dead, the firstfruits of those who have fallen asleep. Point number 1, Christ is the prototype of the resurrection. He's not the exception of the resurrection. Christ is the prototype, not the exception of the resurrection, as Don, Preston, and full preterists like to assert, that he's just the exception of the bodily resurrection of Christ. He's the exception. No. For Paul, in Romans 8:10 through 11, 1 Corinthians 6:12 through 14, 1 Corinthians 15:20 and following here, Philippians 3:20 and 21, Christ is the prototype. They have it backwards. Amazing. But now Christ has been raised, verse 20, from the dead, the firstfruits of those who are fallen asleep. There's a connection. Christ, those that are fallen asleep, physical death. Christ has been raised from the dead. Physically, he was raised. Physically, Jesus' bodily resurrection, the first fruits of those who are asleep. Physical death, according to Don. There's the connection. Will be raised as Christ was raised. Verse 21, for since by a man came death, that's Adam, came death. What death is that? Those that have fallen asleep, physical, biological death, as Don admitted for verse 20. By man also came the resurrection of the dead. For as in Adam all die, physical, biological death, verse 20, so also in Christ all will be made alive. But each in his own order, Christ the first fruits, that's the same as verse 20, which is biological death according to Don. Christ the first fruits after those who are at Christ at his coming. Verse 23, Paul is reiterating what he said in verse 20. And 20 through 28 is one section we need to remember. Then comes the end when he hands over the kingdom to God and Father, when he has abolished all rule, all authority, all power, for he must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet. The last enemy that will be abolished is death. Question: where from verse 20 through 26 do we see anything other than physical death? If 20 is physical death, all the way through has to be physical death. There's no way around that. The last enemy to be destroyed is physical death. And this is speaking specifically of believers, those who are Christ at his coming. Question: was physical death for believers destroyed in AD 70? At his coming. For those that are his, that's the elect, his elect, at his coming. No. We still have physical death today. I lost my father 2 years ago to suicide. He's dead. He's dead. I can assure you of that. He's dead. So the last enemy that will be abolished is death. How can we switch this up from physical to some sort of corporate rising and dying of the body of Jesus in Judaism for 40 years of this meshing of all of individuals into one corporate entity with no individuality? This isn't what Paul's saying, obviously, at all. So Don's fatal admissions at verse 6 and verse 20, and even through in verse 51, which I forgot about, but verse 20 is pivotal. The first fruits of those who were asleep. Christ was raised from the dead. The first fruits of those who are asleep, dead. Physical resurrection for Christ, bodily for those who are asleep. Then he reiterates it again in verse 23. Each in his own order, Christ the first fruits. After those who are Christ, that's the elect, believers, at his coming.